welcome back to another video on Gearsaw Studios, and today I'm going to be showing you how to build yourself a Bedwars map. You can see right here, while built on a modern version, this is in fact a perfectly serviceable Bedwars map. If you were to port this to 1.8 and somehow have all the same blocks, this would actually be a perfectly fine Bedwars map to play on. So, with a little bit further ado, let's investigate how we'd go about this. And by the way, I will not be giving exact instructions on this for obvious reason, because of course this is a very niche build style built off of my skin. So it's not exactly something that you should really copy. Instead, I highly recommend that you experiment with your own palette, choose a couple of blocks, like open the creative inventory, and choose some blocks you want to work with, and then you should start building. This will make it a lot easier on you. Starting off, you need to get some measurements. For this video, I'm going to be building in 1.21.4. Hypixel uses a modified version of 1.7. Then, of course, we need the measurements that's, well, measured from actual maps. And by actual maps, I mean specifically exclusively the orbit map. Hence, this build will be a very similar map in general. Of course, I recommend you try your own shapes because there's a lot of different variants you can see. Anyways, the diamond gens on the orbit map are 58 blocks from each bed, and then each bed is 57 blocks away from each other, which means we have a decently sized map, almost 200 blocks wide. It is exactly 173, assuming diamond gen to diamond gen, so it's a decently sized build. I'm going to be using, of course, lots of diamonds and emeralds. This is not a survival mode build, so we can use whatever we want. If you're just doing this for demonstration purposes, then use all the netherite you want. For this, I'm going to be using a personal palette of mine that's just themed around my channel. For reference, whatever monstrosity I use as a skin, handmade, is going to be what this map looks like. But anyways, we have those measurements, and then just one last thing, 48 blocks roughly to mid. I know it's actually 35 roughly on the map, but the weird shape makes it hard to measure. Let's assume somewhere in the 40 to 50 blocks away range. With those basic ideas about distance, we now need to actually establish a few rules about how to build a Bedwars map. For one, don't build completely out of a block that would be hard to differentiate teams from. Essentially, don't be building completely out of Prismarine, because then how are you going to tell if it's Aqua team or not? In that case, you'd need some part that's easily visible and high contrast. Thus, I'm going to have a little bit of a hard time with red on this map, and thus I will need to find a way to differentiate it. For the sake of this tutorial, I'm going to be building as Aqua team initially. Then, you need roughly 6 to 7 blocks away from the edges of the island, based from the head of the bed, and roughly the same from the shop. Of course, it can be more or less, but make sure there's enough room to set up at least 4 layers of bed defense. And then we need to figure out where are these facing. Some of you might want to be building a diagonally based map, where instead of our things facing towards the center, they might be facing over in that direction. So that way, instead of red and blue fighting, it could be blue and green. Think of it like that. And then of course, the order remains constant: red, blue, green, yellow, white, aqua, pink, and gray. Keep that in mind when setting out your various colors for each team. And now, with all that out of the way, we can actually begin building. And this is actually a pretty simple part. We just need to establish the edges of the island. I'm going to be doing a very geometric style, which will make it easy to follow. But of course, you can have little things like this towards the edge of the island. You can use stairs and stuff. Think of it like that. As long as you have those basic ideas in place and it's fun to play on, then you're probably doing it right. Alright, we have our bed in place and a very simple base plate, untextured, nothing like that. Now, we need to make sure a few things. For one, your environment should be suitable for fighting. Don't have massive holes in the middle of your islands. Of course, for the middle, that's completely fine. But for your actual things here and there, for bases, keep it nice and traversable. It's fine if you have a more naturalistic part. And then, assuming we're doing something like a very square map, this base would be mirrored compared to this base and so on. This is to make sure that it's completely fair, as in, When you make an island, the only difference is that it should be mirrored and recolored. That way, everyone, regardless of team, will have an equal playing field. And not to mention, the diamond generators and even the middle are also symmetrical on all 4 sides. Essentially, like this, each of these 4 corners should be identical. If you colored all the accents on the map gray, you should not be able to figure out which team you're playing as. That's how symmetrical it needs to be. With the general base plate done, and a good way to tell the color, you can look at the rims of the island. Now it's time to not worry about the bottom right now, but rather the actual gameplay parts involving the shop and the top of the base. Right here, I've imported the structure using structure blocks and a bit of file editing, and I did notice that sometimes they will use impossible block configurations, as in, normally there would be redstone torches on top of here. As per Gearsaw Studio's policy, I will not be doing that. However, now we can exactly look at the dimensions. This would be a bed defense, and you can see generator, shop, shop. We aren't going to establish which one's which. Then chest and ender chest. Along with that, there is a way on the back in order to go to higher portions. This is so that way you can mount a defense if your bed is broken or you want to get a vantage point, things like that. Remember, even if most of you guys are probably hyper competitive players, some people are campers, and a good Bedwars map should be enjoyable by all, including casual players that might use bows more, or me, who has carpal tunnel and can no longer do 10 CPS per second and thus am no longer good at 1.8. So anyways, what we want to do is establish an entrance. You can see here roughly the dimensions, make sure it's well lit, and remember that you can use whatever blocks. Nobody's going to say, you're using pale wood. No, we're using white stairs. Think of it like that. Getting some more work done, there are a few things I want to go over. Of course, there's no way you're building this in survival, which means let's do anything. Besides, use debug sticks on iron trapdoors. I'm not going to go that far. But anyways, you can see how I'm using a bunch of colorful blocks on this, and specifically ones for the team color. Ignore the red nether brick for this. That's just the block I happen to choose. You can see what's going on with all the concrete and wool, and that's, well, it's very noticeable. Use your colored blocks. Like you see from this list, use wool, use carpet, use your terracottas. If you're on newer versions, concrete powder, and glazed terracotta are right there. And then of course, your stained glasses are, well, also available. If you do not care for versions at all, candles are perfectly good decorations. However, you won't really need to decorate this place because really, anything that's being used in order to actually play the game, such as the shops, can act as your decorations already. You can see, looks a little barren in here, but it works fine anyways. But now, this is what we call the entrance. I know, very shocking. But if we go 12 blocks back, then we reach the edge of the room. You can see 12 blocks, just like that. And then on this side, this is team upgrades, and then your normal upgrades here, chest, ender chest, and of course your bed, which means it's all working really well together. And then you can see how you can run around here in case you're getting chased, and various things like that. There's a back entrance, there's a staircase up. Make your thing more than just a flat battleground. Incorporate height into it. That's why I put this staircase on the front. I want to see what would happen if players had really easy access to going up. It would make bridging above and putting a TNT drop down a lot less effective. But it would be cool to see how that might work if you block off that staircase. Of course, can't build too close to entrances, but that's a little too much jargon for today. Anyways, play around with height and variation, make it fun to jump around, and make it more than just a flat plane. And then you have to incorporate your actual playable pieces here and there, stuff like that. Feel free to thicken up the walls on the sides here so that way you can have different interiors from your exteriors. See on the back, I can put whatever I want here now. As you continue building this, there's of course something you might notice. And that's just the Hypixel builders are really good. I mean, I think I'm a decent enough builder, at least I know how to teach. I definitely got better over the years. I don't do stuff like that anymore, but still, You kind of need to up your ante if you really want to compete with real Bed Wars maps. So you're going to have to try new things, and that means playing around with more blocks. And with that, you also need to try some blocks that, of course, you wouldn't try normally, like sandstone and birch. Notice how this build uses those really well, and then it has little decorations like these rails. We need to figure out how to emulate that feeling. Why are Hypixel builders so good? Of course, they've been practicing for years. I've been practicing for... Actually, I'd prefer not to share that, but anyways, I've been practicing for a while and I haven't reached their level yet. So we need to do stuff to reach their level, which means incorporating weird decisions, like adding lights in random pieces, trying different palettes, and sometimes it might not work, like I'm not sure if I want tough here, but things like that is what really sets your build apart. You need to try the unexpected. Even if it might look weird, hey, you still need to try it at least once. I mean, my parents said that about vegetables and I didn't follow their advice, but I'm talking about building, so you should probably follow my advice, because why? Good question, but you should follow my advice. With a bit more designing done, we now have the general gameplay elements of this. And you can see it's getting a bit out of hand, so evidently I have a lot of explaining to do this clip. So of course, I am going up against a build that is done by, let's say, slightly better builders than me, which means I'm going to have to work overtime in order to figure out how to make this better. For reference, I've been working at this for about 3 hours. But anyways, here's what you should do. 1. Make sure that your thing isn't flat. Right here, I added these little pieces that look almost like apartments and made the center one jut out, and they have different sizes and shapes. This is to add the illusion of height and depth to it. Then I copied that little piece here with the buttons and put it on my build as well. Remember, you are, well, here to learn how to build. There's no shame in taking a few things from other builds. Just don't pass it off as your own. If anyone asks, hey, I got it from this thing. You know, it's called getting inspiration. Just don't start stealing. But anyways, I added little things, maybe like a little air conditioning vent here, and then right here you can see how I have more accents and such. There's a ladder here to make sure that you have access to these upper floors, and a bunch of stairs so that way you can have a nice Scooby-Doo chase around here. Along with that, there's this little entrance here, and here's the inside. Notice how you can drop in on anyone who's minding their own business down here, and then we have all these little things to make it look like you are inside some sort of massive apartment complex. Of course, downscaled. And then we have an emergency entrance back here, so that way, if there's someone being annoying, you can take this ladder. Will it save you? Probably not, but I like the idea. And then for the inside, you can see how I used a lot more quartz to give it the idea that you are inside something. Let's look on this one to get a similar idea. You can see how it has a much darker color palette compared to the exterior, which uses a lot more sandstone. And thus, it feels different in here. We want to get those kind of vibes. Make your build feel large when it isn't. Then, added these campfires here for special effect. A chiseled block here, I feel like that's something important technical. I noticed a similar pillar out of place here. I'll just include it just to be safe. And then, added something, well, you've probably been seeing it the whole time. These floating pillars. This is a little design motif I have done in a lot of my builds that use this palette. And essentially, you can see how it adds a lot, makes it very easy to tell what team you're looking at, because of course sea lanterns can be a bit close to cyan. And then I included these all around, and also had the unintended side effect of making it look like a hand. Thus, I'm going to be using this a lot more. I also mirrored it over here to get a general idea of how far these bases are. Essentially, you could start bridging from here, or it could have a good vantage point if you started from here, but you'd need some sort of staircase. Things like that is what makes your build not only interesting, but also fun to play on. We need to incorporate that too. Now, it's time to work on the sides. And, well, it can be a little bit daunting. I'm using a very restrictive palette, which means I might have to introduce more things, such as copper, into it. And now, to get a better idea of what we're doing, let's look at the actual map I'm using as reference. Right here, we have a full version of one of those bases. You can see they're really tall actually. And of course, this is how I've been measuring things. You can look up downloads for these maps online if you want to use a physical model for reference. And you can see how it goes down lower and it has a bunch of pipes and wirings on it. Let's get that effect. It looks like there's a lot more stuff, little buildings here, and not to mention easier ways to figure out what base you're looking at. This is really good. It's called good design. We should try incorporating that. For mine, I'm probably going to have something similar to what's under the bed, but I'm also going to have a lot of stacked blocks of quartz here to make it look like it's some sort of apartment and we're entering through the top for some reason. And yeah, that's a general idea of what we want to be doing. You can see how they go so much lower, but you can't actually use these bits. Because here, I'm going to grab a barrier block, and notice how many barriers there are. I'm not going to be doing this on my build specifically, because well, mine's not actually going to be used for gameplay. Of course, if you are a Hypixel developer and want me to recolor it for 1.8 reasons, you can have it. I'm not entirely sure why you'd want specifically mine, but okay. But notice the barriers. Make sure you can't just get caught on something and camp it down here forever until someone gets a bow. That's not fun. Now, with the rest of the build complete, we can now see a bunch of little things in order to figure out what makes this good. Because of course, this one's actually looking kind of comparable in quality now. Is it perfect? No. I mean, of course not. But still, it's certainly something, and it's something that gives a lot of information on how you can do your own. So first off, you might notice right here, we have a little dining room. No, this does not link up to anything. In fact, this build is completely hollow. You do not need to worry about it. If you are going to actually play on it, then you'd probably fill it up with stone, in case someone with an MVP++ lobby turns on the block distractions, and also the lucky block version. But anyways, with that out of the way, you can see a bunch of candles, some basic stuff, the same checkerboard flooring with the gray terracotta, and then the wool that we want to be using, stuff like that. Also, I added buttons here to make it look like your generator is actually an elevator. Then under here, I added a bunch of stairs to add a cool effect, and then a bunch of quartz blocks, not like actual blocks, but cubes, like this, with some tough ceilings, in order to give the illusion that a bunch of buildings are jammed into there. Then I gave them all fake windows. And this effect is really cool. I added lightning rods on some of them to make it a bit more interesting. And then below, I added a very simple slant here. You can count the blocks. It goes stair, block, stair, block, stair. Things like that. Put a creeper face on the back because I didn't know what to do and nobody's going to be looking at this part, so who cares. I added it with a bunch of lava. It just looks cool. And then a mess of pipes. Notice how they go into each other whenever they connect. There's sea lanterns, bunch of stairs, and then even some houses of insane people. So what do you know? We have a pretty interesting building. Maybe incorporate some random redstone gadgets here and there that don't actually do anything. Of course, play around with the depth. So I have this little energy pillar here. And then, of course, maybe do something surrounding the build, like these floating pieces. In a real game, if this were to ever get added, I don't think they could stay, but it certainly looks cool. So, you know, try it. And now, it's finally time for us to actually convert this into 8 separate playable areas. With some of the other islands placed, you can see I have 4 of them. My markers on this side disappeared, or I never placed them, more likely the latter. Which means I'm just gonna have to do those tomorrow, because it's 11:33 p.m. when I'm recording this. But anyways, it's now time to start working on the colors. And this is simple. We just go in and replace everything of a certain color. It doesn't mean that you can't use a certain color in the build, like no white stained glass because white team exists. Don't do it like that. Essentially, just don't make it confusing, but you can use whatever block as long as you make it clear what those blocks are. And of course, beware of any errors. As you can see, this copy has a few errors, but I'm still going to move forward with this. Now, we're just going to do it piece by piece. Now, we have white team, and you can see it translated pretty well. This is why I didn't use white wool on this, I used snow. That way, white team would still look visually distinct. Now, do this for all the other teams. Now you can see I have my color variants in place. And well, it looks really cool. When they're all selected like this, they actually give the original maps a little bit more of a run for their money. Is it perfect? No. Realistically, I could always add tiny little details like maybe replacing some of these bricks with their polished variants and things like that. However, I like the style it's going for right now, so I'll leave them, especially because I already colored them. And a quick thing, if you were building with something like cyan terracotta as a main block, and then, started doing all the different colors, you might have to do a quick sub out. Right here, I was using gray terracotta and cyan wool, cyan terracotta, so I had to replace the terracotta with wool, so that way it wasn't just a non-checkerboarded surface. A little complex to explain. Either way, make sure that you, of course, color the beds correctly. In a real scenario, they'd all be red, and of course a lot of these blocks would magically disappear, but that's beside the point. Now, another thing. We now need to do the diamond generators and then the mid. And by the way, for the actual specifications of this map, the beds are slightly closer together than on the orbit map, meaning side rushes are a bit more effective, while they're slightly further from this direction, but the size of the diamond island might make that up. But here's my idea. I prefer more defensive games where it actually runs for a long time, there isn't one team going around destroying 3 beds, things like that. So you can play around with the height. There's always a rooftop map where you can see right here in this graphic, you can see, well, there's a massive height difference between the beds and then the diamond and emerald generators. Instead, let's have these beds be above that, so that way it's much easier to defend yourself. Now that we have the idea for the map, you can see the emerald generator is on a lower level, which means it's a bit easier to defend, not by much. Of course, I can only go so low here because cloud level versus ocean, I'm not going to get into how high the map is. But anyways, we now have this, and we need to make sure our diamond island is roughly only like 13 blocks in either direction. So like this is probably close to the limit of how large you can make the island, which is not super large, but it's workable. Along with that, it needs to be symmetrical to the islands it faces. Essentially, right here and right here should have equal opportunity. Not a single block needs to be out of place. Over here we can have more walls, and over here and here it doesn't really matter. It just needs to be symmetrical here and here, and then symmetrical here and here. Yeah, that's a lot of things, but basically, imagine it easy to enter from pink and gray team, but it doesn't matter how easy it is from any other direction. Right here, you can see how it's symmetrical towards the front side. And, well, it's not super complicated, I just added a bunch of walls together, and basic things like that. It's not completely finished, but it gets the idea across. If you look from mid, it is perfectly symmetrical, which means these two teams have equal chances of winning over it. As in, it comes completely down to player skill now, which is exactly what we want. Now we can try incorporating some other things like walls in the back, whatever those things are. I have no good name that's not a definition for another word, so these floaty things. Let's try incorporating those into it and then use some light blue. This is why cyan is used for aqua, so that way light blue is completely given to these. And then when you work on the middle, it's also going to use lime, which is the same as green team, but there's not really too much confusion because there's so many emerald blocks in the middle, and it's kind of obvious. With some minor counting errors now fixed throughout the build, you can see I have the diamond islands now complete, and they're not super interesting, but they're definitely serviceable. Of course, you can see they're symmetrical according to the guidelines I had on the last thing. You can see here, green and blue will have equal chances of controlling this. It is all down to the player. And then we have some moss patterns with the lava underneath, same stuff as on the bed islands, and then more lava over here because it looked cool. Notably, I incorporated some glass panes into this to give it a bit more depth. And then a little bit of fake fire, you can see goes white, light blue, cyan, blue, blue. And of course the gaps between them have these weird floating things, except they're made of diamonds. And then one version that is completely symmetrical. It's pretty simple to build that one. But of course, you don't have to. I mean, this whole tutorial is just really a set of guidelines and then my interpretation of them. But anyways, we have this thing on the bottom. By the way, very simple stuff here. It's just a bunch of stairs focusing onto singular points. And, well, redstone torches. They work really well. Try incorporating them into the build. And now, we have the majority of this done. We got our islands, we recolored them, and we have everything else sorted, which means it's time for the middle. While you had a lot of options for the actual placement of the islands, effectively they're always going to play out the same. You're going to have two islands that are the best to rush between the two. Of course, very simplistic map design right there. And then you have your diamond generators, which can either be somewhere like here, at the corners, or potentially just an entirely new map shape altogether, where these two bases are a bit closer together on those corners and then have them right there. There's a bunch of ways you can do this. But the emerald generator, of course, is always at the middle, or maybe the diamond generators are at the middle, who knows. But we have lines of symmetry we need to follow to make sure everyone has a fair chance. However, these can be partially broken, and they've been broken on some maps, which means we have a few options on how we want to build this. The exact middle, we don't have to worry too much about. We can just build a structure as long as it's not significantly impacting gameplay. Like, don't add a giant staircase from green-yellow side that overlooks pink and gray. I mean, now you have a giant height advantage. Don't do something like that, but if you want to do like an asymmetrical statue, you can probably get away with that. Essentially, follow my cursor. We can do it like this, where we have one line here, and then it's pretty much just the same on these sides. Or we can do it like a plus shape down the middle. Of course, they'd have to be symmetrical on the two sides like that. Or we can try a bunch of just smaller options. X, plus, things like that. But now we have to worry about the actual gameplay of it. I recommend that it should be mostly flat. It should be somewhere you can run around on, collect your emeralds, potentially set up shop for a moment, things like that, and then reasonably able to attack other people. Of course, I put my mid lower because I prefer more defensive games. But of course, you might want to even place yours higher to favor those who go to the middle now have an easier time attacking. So who knows what you do with that. Either way, make it generally symmetrical. With the middle now started, you can see you have 4 identical structures. They are properly placed, and well, they're actually kind of interesting. Even though we know this is a center column from a diamond island with 2 weird things orbiting it, and then, you know, a little bit of extra decoration in the form of, well, emeralds and such. Well, there's actually a little bit more going on than meets the eye. Of course, in here in an actual map there'd probably be barriers so you couldn't hide, things like that, but the idea of this is you have to go here initially, unless you take a long route, and then you have to make this jump, which makes it a little bit easier to get people off your tail because now you can just kind of loop around this, you can do block traps, things like that. That's what I really like, and not to mention you have cover, which means if someone pulls out a bow and arrow, you actually have a fighting chance, versus flatter maps like the Pernicious map, you're kind of just left out in the open. And for maps that have very little cover and are very sparse, you kind of just don't have any counterplay. In here, you have some counterplay, but the defensive nature of this map still favors ranged weapons, which I particularly like because, you know, I have carpal tunnel and cannot click fast anymore. But anyways, with all this sorted, and I think this guy might be 1 block higher, oh no. I'll solve that later. Essentially, we have this middle ready, and now we need to get down the exact specifics. In the very center, I'm probably going to have a bunch of these things, maybe in some weird spire. As much as I'd like to include a beacon, I'm probably not, but that would be a really fun gimmick where you could control the center of the map and have special effects. And then maybe pearl to someone's base and have strength there and probably break game balance, things like that. It's a little bit too much. So my idea is the emerald generators are going to be at these corners here. Well, not corners, these sides. And they're going to be at the top of staircases. So that way you can have the height advantage and have an easier time attacking, but you're in the middle of 2 islands. And then you also have those stairs, which means you can block them. You have an easier time defending. That's the idea of this map. It's almost like a more defensive version of Orbit, built in my really weird building style. Right here, we now have the middle, which means this build is done. But of course, there's a lot to cover. From an aerial view, in total, this map is roughly the same size as Orbit. However, the center is significantly smaller. I'm pretty sure it has 10 less blocks on each side. So overall, it's a more compact experience with a bit more bridging. Very defensive map. Along with that, some other things. So here are where I put the emerald generators. And you can see they're just, all at the same point. The symmetry is perfectly down the middle. All sides have equal chances. And then right here, you can see below them, I added a little bit of extra stuff. The same antenna over here on the bottom, I made an emerald version right here. No differences. It's just emerald. And then right here, I added a little bit of a generator. It's definitely the same design as my UFO death rays, but essentially in the middle, you can see, besides this part, this is actually an error I left in. What we do is sea lantern column, then surround it in snow on some parts, then add white. I'm going to remove that column of lime in there that was erroneously placed. Then, of course, we already have these vertical things. You can jump across these gaps. These are one block lower, which means block trapping is easier. I love little tricks like that rather than raw CPS. And then, you can see in the middle right here, a nice area where if you have a knockback stick, you can have a good time. Very fun. There's not too much to this besides, more of the lava and green concrete, and then of course the lava on the bottom. Nothing terribly interesting with all this, and then some fake trees, which you can see are just fences and, well, more terracotta. So yes, this is the build. You can see it's a perfectly functional Bedwars map. Here, if I go in as white team, you can see, well, we have a generator, these would be our shops, ender chest, chest. You can see this island is perfectly serviceable, has staircases around for interesting gameplay, all that fun stuff. You can go back here, you have your back entrance, you can go up, ambush from above, things like that. You can bridge to your opponents, beat them up. You can go over to the diamond generator, not a terribly interesting island, but still an island nonetheless. Or you can go to middle, and it's a very simple middle, slightly lower than the island, so that way it's ever so slightly easier to defend from, and things like that. I love when little things are done in order to make the map slightly different. And then of course, these points right here by the emerald generators, much easier to attack from, which means the middle is not only just an emerald place, but it's a positional advantage. You might want to be at the middle more, rather than trying to go to some abandoned base. So if you bridge out something like terracotta, well, you'd have an easier time. By the way, I have no idea why this glitch is here, I need to fix that. But anyways, yeah, a few minor copying errors due to just world edit shenanigans. But yeah, this is a perfectly functional Bedwars map. And then I'm going to give a little bit of a quick showing of what it would look like on 1.8. Although I'm not going to go through and replace every block like the copper, I replaced the most important blocks in order to get a general feel of what this would be like on 1.8. And this is also in programmer art for that true feeling. And you can see, it still looks remarkably good. Of course, red nether brick is 1.10, so I downgraded it to normal nether brick, looks perfectly fine. Stone bricks work perfectly fine in the place of other things. These walls can just become normal stone brick walls, things like that. And I think this really works well. Of course, it would require a bit more replacement, but hey, if you are in fact Hypixel watching this, you can comment and, well, we can sort it out from there. Nothing too serious. But yay, this is a complete Bedwars map. And then I'm just gonna revert it back because, I don't want to accidentally reload the world and suddenly get stuck with this. But yes, this is what it would look like if I changed the version. So yes, you can do things like that in order to make sure that your builds will work. And with that, it's the end of today's video. If you enjoyed this video, remember, please like and subscribe, it really helps me out. And of course, if you want to be using this on a server, I will give the world download upon request. Of course, you do have to credit me. But anyways, enjoy the rest of your day. Gearsaw out.